So now we're inside of Substance Painter, and we're going to make all of this work. So this is our barrel before. As you can see, Substance Painter works a lot like Photoshop. We have some layers, we have our shelf with a bunch of brushes, and here is where we basically have our different maps that we can paint on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and file new to create a new project. I'm going to discard because I don't really have many changes on this, and we're going to select a template. So we get a template, Unity 5 algorithmic, that's exactly what we want. Mesh, we're going to go ahead and select our low poly, so I'm going to go to select, and these are previous ones that I was working on. So I'm going to go back to assets and go to barrel tutorial, barrel low poly.fbx, click on that. So once we've loaded in, we've got our barrel, and not much else. So inside of Substance Painter, what we can really do here is basically treat it a lot like how you already know Photoshop. So in Photoshop, we have our layers. We also have our brush properties. So here we have layers. Over here we have properties, which is paint, brush. This will give you context-sensitive properties for whatever you select. So if we come in here onto the shelf and select our tools, and we grab this frost tool, you notice that over here it changes. It gives us different sizes. Everything's for this preset. We can go over to weld tools, and we get all the weld tool stuff. Zipper gives us the zipper settings. We can paint zippers. It's pretty neat. So again, like Photoshop, we have the layers over here. We can come in and add a fill layer, change this color to red, and it fills everything in. We can also add masks, so I can add a black mask so it gets rid of everything, and then I can go in, click on the mask. You see how it selects the layer of the mask? We can click on the mask and add in a paint layer here, and then we can paint back the mask. And that's pretty much how we're going to work a lot in Substance Painter. It's very non-destructive and it works very well. I'm just going to delete that fill layer, and we have this base layer. So the first thing we need to do inside of Substance Painter is get all of our information from the other mesh. And the main way that we do that is under the layers, we have these texture set settings. I have tried to reset the UI, but this may be somewhere else. Just look for texture set settings. We'll go down to additional maps and bake textures. This is all the information for baking textures. So for this barrel, we're going to want probably like a 512 or a 1024 texture on it, but I'm going to bake out a 2048. Dilation width, you can hover over it and it'll tell you what it does. It says the width of the dilation post-process in pixels applied before diffusion. So this basically does is it dilates your actual bake. It gives you a little bit of a buffer in pixels, and we can make this bigger or smaller, and it's basically just going to bleed off the edge. You can go into high poly parameters. If you do not have a high poly and we just wanted to bake like the roundness of the low poly, we could do that by clicking here, but we do have a high poly. So instead, I'm going to click this little file icon, and it brings us to the same folder that we got our low poly from. I'm just going to click the high poly. It's there, it works. If we wanted to remove one, we could just remove it. If we wanted to add multiple, we could add multiple. You could use a cage file. What a cage file does is it basically restricts the area for a bake for a mesh. We don't have a cage file, so we're not going to use one, but the way that you could is you could just click here, adding your cage file just like your high poly mesh. This max frontal and rear distance is something that we may have to mess with. What I like to do is leave these at the default, bake everything out, and then see. Basically, these are going to tell Substance how far are you going to search for information. Frontal distance and rear distance are basically saying how far forward and how far backwards are you going to search. Relative to the bounding box is basically just going to take this mesh and it's going to treat it as a size. So it's going to create a bounding box after this based off the width, the height, and the depth. It's going to create a cube, and it's going to use that box to sort of figure out where everything should bake. Averaging normals just changes the way that the computation is done. It's based off of average normals or your softened and hardened normals. Ignoring back faces means that in the high poly mesh, it's going to ignore the backside of a mesh, which is usually what you want. So you want to leave that on. Match. Choose which method is used to match the low and high poly resolution. So here is something we need to know. Right now it's set on to always, and so it's always going to pull all the information. If we had multiple meshes baking, like we had a car, and so we had tires, and tires were a different mesh than the body of the car, we would only want the high poly mesh, high poly information of the tires in the high poly mesh to go to the tires of the low poly mesh. And you could do that here by doing match by mesh name, and then you add in a suffix and a prefix, and it works. Honestly, I think this UI is a little funky because we have match, always, or by mesh name, and then our mesh names are below the setting for anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing is basically just, it's going to fix jagged lines in your texture, and so we're going to set this to 2 because I don't want to sit here and bake all day. But that sets up most of our stuff. The only other thing that we need to go into, because these are common settings, is our ID settings. So when we were in Maya, we set up colors. Those colors are for a mesh ID. So we're going to go to our color source, and we're going to do material color, and that's the color that we did in Maya. And now we don't need a generator because our color source already exists. And then we're going to bake our textures. Substance Painter bakes pretty quick unless you start doing 4K maps, and then when you do 4K with 8x8 anti-aliasing, then Substance Painter can take about an hour to bake depending on your computer. Alright, our bake is done. Everything looks pretty good. If we had any issues with our baking textures, like we were missing information, the most common thing is missing some of these lines, or missing the lines up here is the most common issue you're going to run into. I would go back to bake textures and mess around with the max frontal and max rear distance. And if your bakes are taking too long, I would change your output size to something like 512 so that you can just sort of debug what's going wrong. So again, change your output size to lower so your bake times are shorter, and change your max frontal and max rear distance, and you'll probably find the solution to whatever issue you're having.